Welcome everybody to the first iteration of the Critical Antiquities Workshop for semester 2 of 2021. We here at the University of Sydney have just commenced our first week of teaching, and so it's a nice time to begin our semester 2 workshop. I'll be handing over to my colleague Tristan Bradshaw in a moment to be the master of ceremonies for this particular workshop, but I would just like to begin our session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which our network is based, which is the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'll just say a few words, as we usually do, about the nature of the network and the workshop. The Critical Antiquities Network, of which this is the workshop, was founded by Tristan Bradshaw and myself in 2020, although possibly it might have been 2019 from memory now, but 2020 was when we formally kicked it off. And we formed it to link scholars whose research takes place at the intersection of ancient traditions and contemporary critical theories. For Tristan and myself, the idea of a critical antiquity is that the contemporary critique of modernity and the critique of the capitalist present finds its most powerful impetus, we believe, in its dialogue with the thought and practice of the ancient world. We believe that it is not simply that antiquity offers an alternate pole from which to grasp the present in its historical situatedness, but rather we advance the more radical suggestion that our modalities of critique are founded upon, and perhaps ought to be founded upon, the expansive dialogues we enter into consciously or unconsciously with the form and content of antiquities performances, literature and institutional practices. But our turn to antiquity is not a romantic one. In our view, antiquity simultaneously serves as the standpoint and the object of a critique which enlivens us to the possibilities and limitations of contemporary life. And so far, our network has linked scholars in the UK, US, Europe, Australia. We have an edited book that will be coming out hopefully next year on the role of antiquity in Marx and Marx's reception. And in addition to this workshop, we are preparing further occasions for collaborative work and a website to raise the profile of this area of research and its proponents. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tristan, who will introduce our distinguished speaker today.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so Dennis Schmidt is a professor of philosophy at Western Sydney University, and prior to his arrival in Sydney in 2015, Denny also held positions at Penn State, at Villanova and at Binghamton universities in the US. He's also a regular faculty member of the Collegium Phenomenologicum held in Città di Castello every year, which is a fantastic kind of vibrant hub for work precisely in this area of critical antiquities. Now, it's a bit of a daunting task to try and capture the essence of Denny's work in just a few minutes, because Denny's work traverses quite a wide range of topics, authors and languages within the tradition of continental philosophy. So Denny works on ethics, hermeneutics, translation, art and literature, and most especially in conversation with Plato and Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Benjamin, Heidegger, Gadamer, and Derrida. And that means his work also traverses numerous languages, ancient Greek, German, and French, in addition to English. And his long list of publications testify to this breadth and indeed depth of his work. And I'll just pick out a few highlights here. So among his monographs in English, The Ubiquity of the Finite, published by MIT Press in 1988. Very familiar text to me, I remember reading it as an undergrad, is On Germans and Other Greeks, published by Indiana University Press in 2001. Lyrical and Ethical Subjects, published by SUNY Press in 2005. And Between Word and Image, published by Indiana University Press in 2013. He also has a few edited books in English and in German, such as Difficulties of Ethical Life, which was co-edited with Shannon Sullivan, and Hermeneutische Wege on the work of Gadamer, which Denny knows intimately well, published in German in 2000. And he's also played an important role as a translator and editor of some key texts, such as Ernst Bloch, Natural Law and Human Dignity, which he translated back in the 1980s and published by MIT Press, and also a revised translation of Heidegger's Being and Time for SUNY Press, which was published in 2010. So it's absolutely wonderful to have someone of Denny's caliber local to us here in Sydney, although under current circumstances he may as well be anywhere, but thankfully the time zone is beneficial for both us and him. And we're very, very pleased that he's here today and presenting his paper, Thinking and Moral Consideration. So please join me in welcoming Denny to the workshop.
Well, thank you so much for that, Tristan. That's it was extremely kind. You made my day. And thanks to Ben and Tristan both for organizing this. In these times, this sort of thing is, I think, very important to continue. And thanks to all of you for being here. I know how difficult it is to sit through yet another Zoom session. So I'm grateful to each and every one of you, and it's nice to see so many of you. So I want to begin by trying to lay out the question that I propose we discuss today. I also want to confess that Zoom outwits me, and that I often find myself struggling to follow discussions on Zoom. It's very difficult for me, at least, to listen on Zoom. And so I think one day we'll have to take stock of what this strange historical moment has done to us and how it's changed us. It's changed me. What that means yet, I still don't know, whether it's for better or for worse, but it has made me different. And it has challenged my capacity to listen in some ways. So I want to begin by saying, as a concession to Zoom, I won't present a paper in the way I usually do, but will offer a series of theses, a set of assertions than a nuanced and carefully argued paper. Now, I do this because I will actually number the paragraphs, and it makes it, I think, a little easier to follow. I'll also speak for only about 35 minutes, which, if I manage to do that, will be a speed record for me, an absolute first for me. So I do this on the assumption, and I hope you don't find it insulting, that you, like me, might find it challenging to listen on Zoom from time to time. So I'm trying to address that challenge, and this will be a first attempt at doing that. So the largest formulation of the question I want to ask today, I want us to discuss, is what, if anything, binds us to the good, to a moral orientation to the world? I want to ask how, if it is possible, and the qualification is important, can we come to understand ourselves as first and foremost ethical subjects? That is, not first off as beings who know and cognize the world, but as beings oriented to, for the lack of a better word, the good. In other words, is it possible to understand ourselves as beings whose primary task and self-understanding is not taken to be lodged in our capacity to know the world, but as beings who understand their task as to care for and love the world? Now, I tend to believe that the decision that we first need to know rather than care for the world is what more than anything separates modernity from the ancient world. And so that'll come into play at some point, this substitution. Now, as my remarks develop, I'll try to make this question more precise, but for now, it's a rather imprecise beginning. I hope it can still serve as a beginning. So the question's been asked many times before, and in many different ways, obviously, but the one that I find especially interesting, as Tristan has said, at this moment, is the way Arendt poses this question in her 1971 essay, Thinking and Moral Considerations, Thinking and Moral Considerations. Now, what makes her approach especially interesting to the question, this question, is that she asks it from the point of view of its failure. She asks it from the point of view of the absence of a moral orientation to the world. So how, she asks, is it possible to be morally blind? to not see, to not understand the ethical significance of what one does. This is what makes her approach so interesting. She starts with a kind of moral blindness. Now, being morally blind, being blind to what is right in front of one's eyes is an enduring theme of Greek tragedy. Oedipus, of course, is the figure of such blindness par excellence. And in Greek tragedy, one finds important ways of addressing this question, I believe. Now, I'm not going to do that, but I am going to end with a remark about what tragedy might offer at this point. So Greek tragedy offers important ways of addressing this question of moral blindness. Above all, one finds in Greek tragedy the memento of the very real capacity of human life to call catastrophe down upon itself, suddenly, whether by accident, design, or simple blindness. We learn from Greek tragedy that knowingly or not, we can bring disaster into the world, even monstrous evil. And we learn too, and this is the lesson of Greek tragedy, I believe, we learn too that there's no defense that might ward off this fate. It is the human destiny. But what I find interesting about Arendt's examination of moral blindness is the way in which, in the end, she finds a peculiar possibility, almost a hope, that we might indeed ward off this fate. And so the final words of the essay to which I'm referring are these, I'm quoting now, that you, I'm sure, know them. The manifestation of the wind of thought is not knowledge. It is the ability to tell right from wrong, beautiful from ugly. And this, at the rare moments when the stakes are on the table, may indeed prevent catastrophes, at least for the self. So in saying this, Arendt is offering a kind of hope that Greek tragedy will never be willing to offer. Now, as you know, Arendt poses the question of moral blindness out of her attempt to understand how someone like Eichmann, someone she did not see as either monstrous or demonic, could act as he did. Now, her answer, I'm quoting from the Thinking and Moral Considerations text, is simple, that it was not stupidity, but a curious, quite authentic inability to think. Now, that answer echoes the long-standing philosophical assumption that it's precisely the capacity to think, and I'm not saying to know, but to think, that binds us to a moral orientation to the world. Since Plato argued that no one does wrong voluntarily, and since Aristotle suggested that all things aim at the good, some form of this assumption seems to haunt the history of philosophy. Now, to be sure, there are significant differences in the history of philosophy, that thinking has a homing instinct for the good, is indexed to the good. There are significant differences and important qualifications, of course. But in the case of Arendt, she insists, for instance, upon the Kantian distinction between knowing and thinking. And in doing this, she distances herself from the modern prejudice regarding the priority of knowing. In other words, Arendt becomes slightly more Greek in this sense. But the key point is, and the point I want to think about and ask about, is that Arendt finds that thinking, defined in the largest sense, not as a matter of intellect or knowledge, is the surest bond we have with moral life. And so for Arendt, the puzzling question is, how is it possible not to think? Now, however, what stays intact for Arendt, and I want to keep looking at, what stays intact for Arendt is the kinship between thinking and moral life. That's never really in question, this bond between the capacity to think and the good. Thinking, which as Plato reminds us, turns to the good as if to the sun, for Arendt translates itself into action. Now, this is the same sort of claim that Heidegger makes in his letter on humanism, And I'm invoking Heidegger with a deliberate provocation that'll come up again later, but he makes the same sort of claim in the letter on humanism, in which when he's the text which is thinking about action, in which he says, he claims that, I quote Heidegger, thinking acts insofar as it thinks. In other words, it does not need to be applied. Thinking doesn't need to be applied, but it transforms itself into the world. It translates itself into the world. So for Arendt and so many others, this kinship between thinking and moral life is not in question so much as is the failure to enter into that kinship by not thinking. What troubles her is rather the strange exercise of freedom that manifests itself as the refusal to think. And that's what Eichmann stands for. So the bond between thinking and the good is secure for Arendt. What is not secure is the bond between human being and the capacity to think. Now, one could ask about what one is to do in the face of the refusal to think. And that is, as I suggested, Arendt's question. And I believe at this historical moment, this is an especially timely question and one very much worth considering. The problem, of course, is not new, even if it seems especially virulent today, the refusal to think. I'm not going to talk about the refusal to think simply because all you have to do is read the newspaper, whichever one you want, and you will find instances of what that looks like. And the question of how does one confront the refusal to think is what I'm not going to address. But one does see it, one sees it, for instance, and how stubborn this capacity is. It's put on display by Plato when someone like Thrasymachus, for instance, stubbornly refuses to engage in genuine discussion. Or when Polemarchus says to Socrates at the beginning of the Republic, do you have the power to persuade people who won't listen? This refusal to think, do you have this power? And interestingly, it's a question to which significantly Socrates does not reply. It's Glaucon jumps into the breach to answer that question. So the refusal to think is not new, and how to respond to such a refusal is, I believe, an extraordinarily difficult question. The possibility of refusing to think presents a limit for us that, as Plato dramatizes at the beginning of the Republic, is always surrounded by the possibility of being left with nothing more than the threat of violence. Now, that's what Polemarchus says to Socrates at the beginning of the Republic. What's left for you if we're not going to listen? If we refuse to think, there's nothing left, but can you force us? Now, this is not the question I want to ask today. I don't want to take it off the table, but I want to ask a different question because I believe it's in some ways a little scarier than what to do about one who refuses to think. What I want to ask about now is this presumed kinship between thinking and moral considerations, between thinking and the good. I want to test that bond. Now, Arendt recognizes the importance of this point, this bond, when she begins The Life of the Mind with the question, I quote Arendt, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining whatever happens to come to pass or attract attention, regardless of results and specific content, could this activity be among the conditions that make people abstain from evil doing or even actually condition them against it? And again, in The Life of the Mind, she answers that question with the final words of that text, same words: the manifestation of the wind of thought is not knowledge, it is the ability to tell right from wrong, beautiful from ugly, and this in rare moments when the stakes are on the table may indeed prevent catastrophes, at least for the self. So she reiterates that same point. It's 4 years later, after the essay I'm focusing upon. Now there's a kind of hope and a kind of optimism here that I want to try to understand, because I confess it is difficult for me, and I'll explain why. Now, my intention now, and at this point, so what I've tried to do to this point is explain the question. My intention now is, in what follows, is not to work out the details of Arendt's argument, although I'll return to Arendt in the conclusion and speak about her answer and what I see as the limitations here. But I want to think through on this claim that what binds us to a moral orientation to the world is thinking as such, and nothing more. So let me begin then by saying this is a profoundly, almost uniquely philosophical question. Why that is the case, we can discuss if it's necessary, but I believe this is in many ways the essential philosophical question. However, and so I'm announcing my conclusion at this point at the same time, however, I'm no longer convinced that it permits a fully philosophical answer. And this is going to be the challenge. The answer to the question, to this question, how does thinking bind us to a moral orientation in the world? The answer is, I believe, at most a decision, not a proposition. I'll explain that later. Now, in order to, I want to shift the question a little bit away from Arendt and open it up in a slightly different way that'll take us to a couple different texts. I need to speak personally for just one moment. Now, when I was a student in Germany in 1976, I was lucky enough to hear Elias Canetti give a lecture entitled Der Beruf des Dichters, the vocation of the poet, the calling of the poet. This was 1976. It made a deep impression upon me, obviously, since I've been thinking about it since then. And I now find that it might help explain how I want to reframe Arendt's question and claim. So Canetti opened that lecture on the calling of the poet by citing a poet. And he says, it's someone who was unknown, and it doesn't matter who this poet is. It was never someone celebrated. But the poet wrote, es ist alles vorüber, wäre ich wirklich ein Dichter, ich musste den Krieg verhindern können. It's all over now. If I was really a poet, I could have stopped the war. Now I want to pause a moment with that one. That remark, it's all over. If I was really a poet, I could have stopped the war. It's about, well, I'll explain. That remark was made, it's a dated note in a journal from August 23rd, 1939, which is the same day that Hitler and Stalin signed the Non-Aggression Pact. So the remark sounds quite delusional at first. You know, what sort of hubris could lead anyone to say something like that, let alone a poet, and above all, one who was not even known? But as Canetti goes on to argue, and this is what so impressed me as a student, but as Canetti goes on to discuss that remark, that genuine sense of defeat, because one hears the mood of defeat there, it's all over. If I was really a poet, I could have stopped the war. Canetti says that remark needs to be understood as born out of a deep sense of the responsibility of the poet. And it's this responsibility of poetry that Canetti wants to discuss. Will end up wanting to discuss the responsibility of thinking in a different way. So the conviction of the poet that Canetti unfolds is that language forms the center, the heart of human affairs, of conflict and community and spiritual life. And that it's the calling of those who care for language to cultivate and the best of what defines this heart of human affairs. It's the calling of the poet to care for this heart, this center of who we are. Now, the remark Kennedy cites expresses the despair that this poet felt that those who care for language have proven weaker than other powers. They've been beaten. If I was really a poet, I could have stopped this. So the conviction is in the force of poetry, the power of poetry. And he says, I must not have been, because poetry is strong enough to have stopped this. Something has overpowered the power of language itself, which is so great that he feels defeat. So this failure is devastating and threatens the calling, the raison d'etre of the poet. If the calling of the poet is not to tend to the heart of human affairs by loving words, then poetry is merely idle, something for those with the luxury of extra time. If poetry does not have a calling more significant than that, if poetry's calling is to love words and to tend to the center of human affairs, then it is a responsible human activity. And then poetry is something more than simply an inconsequential pleasure. And if it is not able to have this power, then we need to concede that poetry is indeed weaker than real power, which is at work in the world. So the poet is facing power, and I'm going to set the philosopher up against power in a moment as well. So before moving forward, so I just wanted to lay out that remark by Kennedy, because it will parallel so much of what I want to say about thinking and about the task of philosophy and my despair about the possibility of philosophy today. Now, before moving forward, let me pause and make a comment about this word responsibility. I just want to push pause for a moment and say it's easily misunderstood. I said that Kennedy says the poet feels a deep sense of responsibility. I'm not suggesting, or Kennedy's not suggesting, that in saying that the poet is responsible, that the poet is being held accountable. Accountability is not what we mean by responsibility. Accountability is a juridical notion, looks backward in order to ascribe guilt or innocence to someone. Accountability belongs to the economy of crime and punishment, not to the realm of moral life. So to speak of responsibility as a moral matter is to speak of the future rather than the past. The responsibility that drives the remark of that poet is far deeper, far more profound than any sense of being accountable can explain. Now, indeed, it's this sense of being responsible that is at the heart of the question about thinking and moral considerations that Arendt unfolds. That thinking is what gives birth, is the birthplace of this responsibility, sense of responsibility. Just as for the poet, it's a relation to language, is a deep sense of responsibility that is born at that moment. Now, my concern and the mood driving the way I want to ask this question about the bond between thinking and ethical life is not that I worry that we might face only the problem of the refusal to think. That we face that problem is clear, but a more frightening problem, terrifying problem, namely that the ethical bond that Arendt found uniting thinking and moral considerations, thinking and the good, the bond that has so long animated the history of philosophy since Plato and Aristotle, that this bond is broken. That we no longer know how to be, we're no longer able to be truly responsible in the world to one another. So I must confess that I do not share the optimism that Arendt expresses. My worry, my despair is that somehow we've lost or broken or forgotten the importance of this originally ethical task and orientation of thinking. That bond that unites not only human beings, but human beings to the world and to the non-human has disappeared. So a sort of nihilism, a proliferation of empty words has taken hold, and language gets hollowed out. And to put it gently, I believe we live in a time of crisis. And this is what I'm trying to understand, because I think the crisis involves the condition and the understanding of philosophy itself. And here, I need to make what I feel might be a leap and say that I'm not sure that philosophy is up to the task. So I feel like Canetti's poet sometimes, and I want to say, it's all over. If I was really a philosopher, I could have prevented, and now there's a long list that goes from climate change to racism, to sexism, to inequality, to poverty. In other words, you know, take your pick. I feel like it's all over. If I was really a philosopher, I could have prevented that. When I was writing this, I started making a list, and the list got even more depressing than what I've been saying thus far. So you can fill in your favorite problem. I want to ask today something like the question of wozu Philosoph in dürftiger Zeit. You know, of course, that Heidegger writes this essay after the war, wozu Dichter in dürftiger Zeit. After World War II, Heidegger writes the essay, you know, what are poets for in times like these, citing the line from Hölderlin. And Adorno writes the celebrated line that after Auschwitz, one can no longer write poetry. I think Heidegger's answer is that after Auschwitz, only poetry will suffice. But that's a different question, because the question I want to ask is not about the poet, but wozu Philosoph, to what end is philosophy in a time like this? Now, I'm not interested in the particular reasons our times are so desolate, and I don't believe that I have to really make much of an argument to say in this Zoom life that we live right now, that we are living in difficult times, to say the least. So I'm not going to make that argument. But I want to ask, what is the place, the task of philosophy in these times? Or have we lost already to the real powers? And I put that in quotes, the real powers at work in the world. This is the feeling, this is why I called back to the feeling of that line from Canetti. You know, it's all over. A different power has won. Now, in asking this question, I want to be absolutely clear that I do not mean to ask how philosophy can be made relevant or how any theoretical insights could be applied to the world. That is the absolute last thing I want to ask. Nothing could be more remote from this question I want to ask. In fact, I would suggest that such an instrumental sense of philosophy, that we make philosophy relevant, that we find out how to apply these ideas, is precisely a sign of the sort of decline that I'm trying to talk about. So it's not about making philosophy relevant. It's not about asking whether philosophy has become irrelevant, but whether it's lost its force. And where does it derive that force? Because if ever it had a force, it derived it from the bond between the assumption that thinking and the good were bound together. So this sense that philosophy has lost to power, that thinking has lost its own force, is not new. And I believe it's a real issue driving what is one of the most glaring examples of moral blindness that we have. And I'm speaking, of course, of Heidegger's Rektoratsrede, his rectoral address. Now, I'm referring to Heidegger for multiple reasons, and in part as a provocation, and in part because I do find him a fascinating problem of moral blindness of a special kind. And so I want to bring him forward into this discussion as well, and it's not insignificant for Arendt. But one of the most potent examples, glaring examples of the question of relation of philosophy to power is found in Heidegger's rectoral address, which opens with a citation from Aeschylus's Prometheus. Now, Heidegger translates the citation from Prometheus as Wissen aber ist weit unkräftiger denn Notwendigkeit. So knowledge is far less powerful than something more necessary. In other words, there's a weakness here, and power is what is left for us. It's a horrifying way for the rector of the university to open an address to say, knowledge is far less powerful than something else. And he closes that address with a citation from Plato's Republic, that he translates as alles große steht im Sturm. You know the passage in book 6, and he omits, everything great stands in the storm. Everything great stands in turbulence. And so this very violent image, and he says, and he omits from the quotation that he ends the rectoral address with, the previous line in which Socrates asks the question, by what means will a city avoid being destroyed? By taking philosophy in hand. So Socrates's question is, how does philosophy fit itself into a city with, but he says, without the city being destroyed. And then the answer is, for everything great is at risk, which Heidegger translates as everything great stands in the storm. Now, I won't take up the case of Heidegger. I just wanted to lay it out there as a kind of provocation. And especially, as I said, because I believe he poses a fascinating and troubling question for us. And I will not concede that Heidegger simply did not think, that he was a sort of academically trained Eichmann. Yet I will absolutely assert that he's an example of moral blindness in the extreme. In other words, this is the problem that the figure of Heidegger poses for us. I'm not sure we're really yet able to understand just how profound a problem is that we face in the figure of Heidegger, but at least we can say that he stands as a figure who shakes one's faith in the bond between thinking and moral considerations. Now, some people have managed to say Heidegger never thought. I can't do that for several reasons. I can say later if we need to. So I suspect that these questions of power, moral life, responsibility, blindness, and philosophy haunted Plato more than we typically admit. His life is bookended by what one can only imagine as profound disappointments. When he was in his late 20s, the teacher he loved died at the hands of the city he loved. In his late 60s, his final trip to Syracuse was a disastrous effort to translate the ethos of a philosophical life into a political ethos. And yet somehow, like Arendt, who also suffered, Plato manages to hold fast to the conviction that a life devoted to thinking, not to any particular doctrine, but simply to the act of thinking, is worth living and good. So Arendt turns in her essay to Socrates in order to find the exemplary case of a philosophical ethos that is defined by its commitment to the morally good. And she turns to Kant as one who has theorized the necessary character of this commitment. So in other words, Arendt turns to Socrates as the performative figure of the bond between thinking and moral life. Socrates is interested not so much in what he says, but in the performance of this bond, while she turns to Kant as one who keeps this bond at the heart of his thought, his theorizing. So she turns to Socrates and to Kant as almost as a theorizer of Socrates. Of course, he didn't, that's not the case that he did that, but that's how Arendt sets this up. I will only note in passing that she did not take up the figure of Heidegger as posing a real problem for her argument. It would have been very difficult, but also very interesting had she tried that. Now, instead for Arendt, Socrates and Kant become the real resources for how we're to understand what it means to think responsibly, to think in a way that responds to, replies to the world as a moral universe. So rather than try to follow through on Arendt's comments on Socrates and Kant, I want to simply ask what unites them as resources for understanding this question of the bond between thinking and the good. In other words, what do these strange bedfellows of Kant and Socrates have in common? Now, strangely, and perhaps a little uncomfortably, it's Heidegger again who might offer a real clue as to what needs to be said here. At the end of the letter on humanism, a text devoted to the question of the relation of thinking and action. I'll interrupt myself here to say that in 1946, at the end of the war, with the utter devastation, the revelations of the horrors and monstrosity and so many evils, Sartre will give the existentialism as a humanism lecture. It's people were hanging off the rafters when he gave this lecture. And the question was, we need to begin again. What is the most fundamental place from which we can begin? We can think our beginning. And he writes the lecture on humanism, humanism and existentialism. And then Heidegger replies, and Heidegger's reply needs to be seen in the context of precisely the kind of question I'm asking today. But he replies, Sartre gives this lecture and stands up and says in this auditorium, which according to all reports was just packed, many hundreds of people. Sartre stands up and says, philosophy is needed again. And Heidegger concludes his lecture by saying, it's time we finally break the habit of overestimating, I'm quoting Heidegger, of overestimating philosophy and of asking too much of it. In other words, we've reached a certain limit with what philosophy is and can do. So this, I believe, is what unites Socrates and Kant above all, and what makes them interesting for Arendt. Both share a deep sense of the limits of philosophy, even of thinking as such, insofar as we're willing to understand philosophy as a sort of radical fidelity to thinking itself. Now, of course, there are going to be problems with this. I mean, Socrates will be talking about the philosopher king. There are all sorts of ways in which this kind of remark is problematic. But I think in the end, at bottom, this is what attracts Arendt to both Socrates and Kant at this point, is a deep sense of how philosophy itself is full of limit. And it's at the limit that it becomes most what it needs to become. Now, as a way of bringing my remarks to a sort of closure, I promised I wouldn't speak too long, but I wanted to speak in a way that will open a discussion. I want to mention 3 points about what I believe about this commonality uniting Socrates and Kant. I want to elaborate 3 themes and hope we can discuss them. The first point I want to suggest is that both Socrates and Kant are utterly oriented by the limits of thinking, not by the capacity of thinking. In the end, neither thinks of these limits dialectically, at least in the sense that we find in Hegel, but there's a sort of self-surpassing at work. In other words, the limits of thinking are inscribed in a constitutive way. The real limits of thinking are found, these limits are found in the resistance of life to thinking. They stand as a reminder that life will always exceed what I can say, know, do, control, or even understand. Now, for both Socrates and Kant, the more one thinks, the more one confronts the limits of one's own understanding. So this is the point, I think, that Arendt needs and also needs to emphasize. Socrates speaks of this notion that the more one thinks, discovers not the confidence of thinking, but the limits of thinking. Socrates speaks of this in terms of his essential ignorance. An ignorance that is his chief feature, even at the moment of his death. I took out the section in which I tried to discuss the final words in the death scene in the Phaedo, because I think even his final words are testimony to a certain sense of his awareness of his own ignorance. And Kant speaks of this sense of finitude of the human in many ways, but nowhere more profoundly than in his remarks in the third critique about the feeling of life. He says, the feeling of life is that which we can never grasp, and it will always exceed thinking. And it becomes the source of the pleasure that I know in the beautiful. So in the end, for both Socrates and Kant, thinking humbles one who thinks. And as a sort of collateral effect, this being humbled, I believe, translates itself into a sort of deep generosity. It's a bit of a leap to say that, but I believe one can demonstrate it in both Socrates performatively and Kant theoretically. That thinking is humbling. And as a result of this, there's a growth of respect for Kant and generosity as well. And perhaps there's no greater shared trait defining Socrates and Kant than such a generosity. Second point, I said there were three to conclude. Second point is that neither Socrates nor Kant, both of whom are deeply moral thinkers, is willing to give any content to the conception of the good. Both recognize that the good is not a body of knowledge at one's disposal. And indeed, both recognize quite well that the dangers posed by the righteous who believe themselves in possession of the good are immense. The sort of arrogance of those who claim to know the good is as great a danger as those who refuse to think. And so righteousness becomes as much a problem as the refusal to think. Real moral sense refuses to be captured in a concept, refuses to become a doctrine, to be translated into a logos, or to become an idea that one applies. It remains, the good remains always unthinkable. Third point, for both Socrates and Kant, the good which is never really able to be thought of as itself, and this is the one I find most interesting and most neglected by Arendt, the good which is never able to be thought as itself aligns itself with the beautiful. So for instance, in Philebus, Socrates speaks of the need for the power of the good to take refuge, to take shelter in the nature of the beautiful. 64b. You all know the passage. That the good finds shelter in the beautiful because it has no place else it can reside. While Kant will find in the third critique that at its summit, beauty is the symbol of ethicality. It's section 59 of the third critique. Beauty is a sort of, and the phrase he uses, eine Belebung des Lebens, a quickening of life itself that we cannot grasp. It resists the concept. So it's at this point, and here the beautiful becomes, I think, where something else takes over. Here, the limits of philosophy need to yield to something else. But at this point, one finds the birthplace of something like a sense of responsibility. of loving and caring for a world that exceeds what I can think and know in this discussion, in this these remarks about the beautiful. So I'm very well aware of how loosely I've spoken of both Socrates and Kant. I'm going to try and conclude in less than 4 or 5 minutes. Such generalities, I've generalized, I know, and are always risky, and I doubt I've eluded all of the risks, but I do stand by the general point, and I do believe it is at the heart of what gives Arendt hope for the world in which we live. That the failure to think that Arendt found so bewildering and appalling in Eichmann is a failure to not acknowledge one's ignorance. It is the ability to arrogate to oneself a sense of righteousness and to be blind to the beauty in the world and what that really means for us. And I think what one could find in Arendt, I don't really find it in Arendt, but where one can be led to is the understanding that thinking, on the other hand, is an intensification of who one is. It's an intensification and an affirmation of life and the world. And understood in this way, to think is simply to respond to the world from the deepest sense of who we are. So let me end with 4 quick claims that haven't, reminding you of 4 quick claims that haven't been answered as of yet. First, I did not answer what we're to do in the face of the refusal to think. And I honestly don't know how to respond to that. The moments in Plato that seem to be most productive for talking about the refusal to think tend to be the comical moments in Plato. And so perhaps in those moments, we see something different emerging, and we see what it means, what one does in the face of the refusal to think. It's strange to suggest that comedy is the answer, but I'm beginning to think it might make sense. Second point, the case of Heidegger. I said there are 4 things I didn't answer. The case of Heidegger. I've grown up philosophically struggling with Heidegger's political life, with his writings that are disturbing and his quite unbearable silence about so much. And this struggle is that I will never be able to dismiss what I've learned from Heidegger, especially since everything I've learned points me in the opposite direction of what troubles me about his person and his work. Now, this is not something I expect to solve, but it's worth reflecting upon. And I think we should, insofar as we can, ask this question. And when Gadamer met Heidegger on the streetcar right after the war, he remarked to Heidegger, "Not zurück von Syracuse." So you're back from Syracuse. The allusion to Plato is important here. So it's Plato's sense that philosophers need to take power to govern, something that Heidegger insisted upon in his rectoral address that might need more attention. And so the relation of philosophers to power is a question I think one needs to ask. Thirdly, I spoke of my sense that philosophy has lost its place and force in the world. My sense of despair is, I believe, a reflection of the problem posed by finding ourselves in universities. We're lucky, you and I, who have these privileges. We're very privileged, but it might come at a high cost. And minimally, I can say that the problem that Arendt posed when she spoke of the kinship of thinking and moral considerations is not immune from considerations of the structures of the university in which we now so easily acclimatize ourselves. So it is something I do think we need to think about. Finally, I said that I believe that the question I've been discussing is a uniquely philosophical question, but that it might not permit a philosophical answer. Here, I'm increasingly convinced that this is the case, that in the end, each of us needs to make an existential choice, one that is without reason, even if it has many reasons, to affirm and love the world or not. Kant, in his generosity, commented that no human being is without any moral feeling. For if one were completely unreceptive to it, one would be morally dead. And in a similar way, Arendt struggled to understand how someone like Eichmann could be understood. I've come to believe that this is a question philosophy cannot answer. Insofar as thinking is so alive, so wedded to the good, so affirmative of life, it can never fully understand its own absence. And this is a riddle that will never quite escape. And moral blindness will forever, as a result, be our possibility. And I want to end by saying that the real test of how we meet this riddle is not found in our capacity to see that blindness in others, but to recognize it in oneself. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Denny, for a very moving and incredibly thought-provoking discussion. My mind is buzzing and I'm trying to get all the thoughts out down on paper and put them in order so that I can make sense of it for myself and ask you questions to elaborate for myself. But while I do that, I'll open it up to everyone else to do the same. So with the questioning, we'll try and use the chat function as best as we can. So if you have a question, you can indicate that to me by typing the letter Q, or you can type your question and I can read it out for Denny, however you like. Are there any questions? Okay, Ben.
Not so much a question, but just an expression of just having listened to something extraordinary. In a way, well, there's a number of things I could say. One is that it captures the spirit of what I think the Critical Antiquities Workshop is all about. But that sounds banal to say that. There's something very expansive and extraordinary about what you're saying. I think for all thinkers in the world, I think they need to hear what you've just said. I think at this particular historical conjuncture, I was just very, in fact, I haven't been moved by a seminar paper for a very long time, but it was very moving. And I felt as though there was a lot that you were saying that was speaking to me almost directly. It was uncanny in a way. To get to a kind of more substantive sort of question or points, if you like, or observations, when you were talking about die Beruf des Dichters, the calling of the poet, I kept thinking of Aristophanes' frogs, right? And then you talked about comedy as being a possibility for this solution to this malaise. And of course, Aristophanes thinks that poetry is a solution to the malaise as well. Does Aristophanes figure in this somewhere?
Thanks so much for your kind comments, Ben. And for the impulse to try to write this in any event. Should Aristophanes be there? Yes. When I was working on tragedy some years ago, and the book that Tristan mentioned, which is now 20 years old or something, I was able to get into the University of Pennsylvania library and get some rare books, 18th century books. It was very dark and the lights didn't work well, and I'm crawling around on the floor trying to find some 1790 text, first edition. And I'm sitting there and all of a sudden I get hit on the head with a book. I don't know what happened, but a book fell and hit me on the head, and it was called Eine Theorie des Komischen, a theory of the comic. And if ever I should have taken a message from the gods, it was at that moment that you know, I was getting a message from above, quite literally, that I should give up on this point and maybe think about comedy. And I think the question of comedy is really interesting at this point. And it is, when I think about how Plato deals with those who refuse to think. And let me pause and say, you know, I'm constantly reading the paper and thinking, saying out loud, is, you know, these idiots, but I worry about becoming self-righteous at the same time, so confident in myself, you know, that I'm going to say, why don't they do this? It seems so evident. So, you know, there is always the problem of this refusal, but Plato does well by poking fun at them. You know, I think Plato is much more comedic than we often give the chance to acknowledge. And so I think finding the comedic in Plato is one thing we could do. But in terms of Aristophanes, yes, I just want to say it's the limits, and I'm not being humble, I'm just being honest in this case. It's genuinely the limits. Being hit on the head by a book 20 some years ago in the UPenn library still hasn't penetrated into my thick skull that, you know, maybe thinking about comedy is the issue. But one of the problems with comedy is an interesting passage in Hegel in the Phenomenology where he talks about the end of art, and the end of art is kitsch almost. It's the end of art is really the comedic, because in the end, what happens is you drop the mask and you become a pure individual, you become a pure idiom. And in the Greek sense of the word idiom, you know, you become almost an idiotes, you know, almost an idiot, you know. And so the singularity of life is really quite not just tragic, but also absurd, you know. So I do think that your remark is something that would be important to do. One of the things I've also noticed is philosophers tend to be much better with tragedy and death than comedy and something else. And that's a constitutive problem that I struggle with. And I don't think, given my personality, I'm going to have much luck with it, but we'll see. But thank you.
No, thank you very much. I'll pass it on to Tristan again.
So we have a number of questions coming up in the chat. Danny Selamager is first. Danny, would you like to ask your question, or do you want me to read it out?
I can ask it, but I have quite shaky internet. So if I shake out of existence, then please, I'll pass to you.
Okay.
Danny, thank you. As I said in my chat, these are papers, and also her book, Men on Dark Times, which also circles around similar issues that I have worked with and thought about for many years. So I had two related questions, and feel free to answer either or both. So one is in the set of figures, so you talked about Socrates as the exemplar of practice and Kant as the theorist, and I just wanted to put Lessing in there as a third, who she speaks about in Humanity in Dark Times when she accepted the Lessing Prize. And what was really at the core of his practice of thinking was friendship. And so there was, you know, I know in her work there's this tension between pluralistic or plurality in politics and thinking, which is seen as more of a solo act, although she does say it involves going visiting. But for Lessing, friendship was at the heart of thinking and displaced truth. So that's one figure. I just wanted to ask you what happens if you bring him in. And then relatedly, but I guess a bit more radically, is, you know, I noticed that early on in your remarks, you made a comment about the way in which this ideal of thinking as a moral orientation brings us to care for the human and the non-human, or I would say the more than human. But if it is the case, as many of us are, many people are contending, and I would say we're being pressed on by the more than human world, that a model of human exceptionalism, an hostile anthropocentrism has been intrinsic to the model of thinking, and that model of human exceptionalism is also at the root of the current ecological crisis, then is it not the case that thinking that is going to be morally attuned or capable of being responsive to the more than human needs to be undone at that root? So it's taking it, from an Arendtian context where she's very much thinking about intrahuman violence to the current context, which is clearly at the heart of what you're thinking about. So those are my two questions.
Thank you so much. They're both really excellent questions. I'll try to answer the second one in more detail. The first, it's again, I don't know either the Arendt piece or the Lessing well enough. The only Lessing I've really worked my way through is the Laocoon, which I absolutely love. But when I was hearing your question, your remark about friendship, I did think about conversation and dialogue at this point. And I suspect that, and this goes to even the question of the limits of thinking and what dialogue means in for instance, Plato. But the question, one can only have a dialogue among friends in a certain way. There has to be this openness and this willingness to care for the other enough to suspect that they could be right. Otherwise, it's not a dialogue, it's a debate. And there's a difference between the dialogue and the debate. And here, while I don't know the Lessing, I think someone like Gadamer would be extraordinarily interesting to bring in, because he's made the question of dialogue and friendship in this way at the heart of things. But your remark about the Anthropocene and the question of the human and the human exceptionalism, I think does go to the heart of what is really interesting is this question of the limits of the human. And the limits of the human, I tend to believe, are not outside of the human. I mean, the limits of the human are found in speech, in dreams, in death, in the most ordinary of human events. I mean, this sort of saturation of our own, being taken to our own limits. But I think this is what philosophy, when it's good, is able to do. But it's also what I think, and this is where the work of art is really interesting, is can bring before us, the very sense of the how saturated we are with the limits, and not just of our understanding, but of our being in the world. This, my relationship with Tristan and Ben goes back to the beginning of their network, still only by email, but I was going to give a talk. I looked over my notes the other day, and I was going to give a talk that has since been published and so off the table, but about the stars. And how we think about the heavens in antiquity and the present. I think that's one of the places in which one finds it as well. There's a sense in which one becomes small, and there's Nietzsche's remark that this being that on the planet thought it was so clever and invented knowledge, and then it disappeared. It all goes together with the sense of humbling. So yes, I think in terms of standing as a kind of reminder of what it means to be human, it is in many ways to be aware of the limits of what that can mean and be, and of the responsibility of being human. So that's a not so very good answer to a very good question.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Richard Holt has typed a question. Richard, would you like to read out your question?
Hi, Richard.
He's just told me he's got a noisy dog and he wants me to read it. He wrote, "Thank you so much, Denny, for emphatically thoughtful meditation. Would you say a bit about what kind of thinking Arendt believed could forestall evil? What does she mean by thinking? It seems rather different from Kant's practical reason or Heidegger's thinking of being."
Yeah, no, thanks, Richard. And it's nice to have you here. It's some people I haven't seen in years, which is one of the great collateral benefits of the sad moment is, we do Zoom and do show up in this way. So Richard, I think Arendt died fairly young. And I mean, I believe she was 69, and just coming to the point where I think she was about, I am not an Arendt scholar by any means. I really have no authority in this, but I do believe that the last lectures on judgment and Kant's third critique would have, I don't believe what we have in that little text called Kant's Lectures on Politics or whatever it's called. I don't believe that does it, but I believe that her engagement with the third critique would have, I would have hoped, pushed her very far towards away and not thinking of Kant's practical reason or practical philosophy, but thinking of the question of judgment and the way in which judgment opens and rewrites the question of thinking in an interesting way. I think from the point my reading of the three critiques is that the third critique rewrites the first two from top to bottom. So I would think that it would be pushing forward into something like what one could find in Kant in the question of judgment and in the pleasure that one takes in the beautiful. In terms of Heidegger, yeah, I think there are so many different Heideggers, but I think, well, I don't know how to answer it, to be honest. The Heidegger I find really interesting on this point is a lecture, I know you know Heidegger as well as anyone I know, but the lecture he gave, the talk he gave after the war, not after the war, the bombs were still falling nearby, but called Armut, poverty. And it's really a kind of Meister Eckhardian sermon on the poverty of thinking. It's one of the most interesting ones. But I don't know how Arendt might differ from Heidegger and the thinking of being. I do believe that Kant, so to answer your question as bluntly as I can, I do believe that Kant, especially the Kant of the third critique, would have become far more interesting to her given what I see of her trajectory. But again, I'm not a Arendt scholar.
Okay, we've got a question from Ken Lambert. I might just go ahead and read that. What if Aristotle and the philosophical tradition rests on a mistake, that we by nature desire the good when we actually desire unconsciously something very different, namely satisfaction? Responsibility would then be tied to the relation we adopt to this unconscious desire for satisfaction. The poets, artists in the broadest sense, after all, explore the unconscious realm, so they may provide guidance here. Freudian psychoanalysis as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Ken and I go back to undergraduate days. I think we took our first philosophy classes together.
50 years ago.
50 years ago. Yeah, I was 3. And I was a fast learner at the time. That's the scary thing. I mean, I would assume that most of us here have made the decision to commit ourselves to a certain possibility, and the possibility that reasoned discourse has its value. As you can see from the remarks I made, that's being shaken at the end of my life. And seeing you reminds me that I got into philosophy because of, we were students during the Vietnam War, and the sense of being something at risk, and the sense that philosophy mattered and philosophy was at stake. So yeah, that is always at the borders of what we think and what we need to think about, whether or not in the end we're driven by desires and questions that exceed what we can think about. And I do think Freud, Lacan, I mean, I think it's real, we can't ignore it. But I can't give up the sort of promise that we were promised 50 years ago when I started, and you and I started.
I just want to follow up on that for a minute, if I could. And, you know, one of the things I love about Hegel, one of your philosophical mentors, is that he made an effort of reason to comprehend the irrational. Probably one of the first philosophers to do that, inventing a whole new concept of reason in order to do that. And his philosophy of art, certainly, philosophy of religion, history of philosophy, and so on, the whole idea of absolute spirit involves that. And it's a kind of thinking that is very different from the tradition. I think it's a radical break almost with the tradition, maybe even with Aristotle and the Greek tradition in that way, certainly owing a lot to the Greeks. But comprehending, an effort of reason to comprehend the dark side. I don't think anyone did it any better, maybe until Freud. And Freud, in a way, is kind of the twin of Hegel there.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And it really is, in the end, Hegel comes down on the side of philosophy. And I had an argument in Italy with Bill Richardson, who was a strong Lacanian. And we were, late at night, we were raising our arms, and I quoted Shakespeare of the St. Crispin's Day speech, you know, the we few, we happy, happy few who bear these wounds. And the question was, there's a line in Hegel where he says, the wounds of spirit heal and leave no scars behind. And there's a way in which, in the end, and this is a rant too, in the end, there is a certain hope towards which we index ourselves. And that's what I was asking about. And that's why Greek tragedy haunts so much of this. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions. Joshua, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, Viznik has asked to ask a question.
That was pretty good, Tristan.
Thanks.
Hey, Denny, thanks for the paper. So
Hey,
I have a few questions. What is power? You know, you've set up this kind of polemic that power is something that thinking must address, and power is something that might prevent thinking from happening. The second question is, you said that we're living in a critical moment in history, and that this bond of thinking and the good is broken, even perhaps irreparably so. And you also said that this is a decision. And I have a little repulsion towards that. And I want to give an example that I don't know if agrees or disagrees whether or not I should have that kind of repulsion towards that. So in Simone Weil's The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, she defines force as that which makes objects out of humans. It can kill us by turning us into a corpse. It makes us into raging animals and turns us into stone. You know, prevents us to think. And she says that that this force strips us bare, but also that by divine miracle, we can be saved from its devastating force, or the violence that is done to us. So from what I understand of that, it seems like that this danger of thinking, or impossibility of thinking, is something that Greek tragedy has been always on point about. But then the issue of divine, like, you know, something beyond us must happen, also, I think, puts a limit on whether or not we do have a decision. You know, even if we do decide, perhaps it doesn't matter. I don't know. And sorry, the final question is, after speaking about this decision, you said that you had to talk, you need to talk personally, which I thought was a very interesting kind of transition? Why must one speak personally to make this claim, or if you need to?
Thanks, Josh. I really appreciate those questions, and it shows that we've been having conversations for so many years now, and it's a pleasure to see that. Let me say a couple things. First, about the question, what is power? I think if I were, I really haven't tried to theorize power. Were I to do it, I probably would, turn to Foucault for a lot of help, but I don't know that Foucault will give me all my answers. But I think power is just in the strictest sense a kind of violence, that I think about. And your invocation of Simone Weil is, I believe, well chosen, because Simone Weil is trying to think in the most extreme case what violence does to us. What she does, I mean, force turns the human being into an object. It objectifies us. But I think what Simone Weil doesn't do is there are gradations of force. And I think force comes in various ways. And what she's thought, and I think what one finds in Homer, is the exercise of force, in its extremity. But the interesting thing is, even in Homer, especially in the Odyssey, one finds this struggle, this contention, in so many places. So I do think Homer would be interesting. Finally, you say, why did I have to speak personally? I think in the end, that's what it goes to the point of saying that in the end, I think philosophically, conceptually, one reaches a certain limit where one has to reach and say, from a point of view that might not have its own justification. So that was why that. I find myself doing that more and more. But I think that's what literature can offer as well. I mean, literature is able to help us bridge those worlds.
I think we just have time for one more question. So Ethanadora has asked, could this be a question that's answerable or should be answered by psychology rather than philosophy? The discussions on thinking so far sound like they all conceive thinking in terms of strictly the rational, reflective, explicit kind of thinking, but cognitive psychology seems to be saying that a lot of our cognitive processes happen in a more intuitive, implicit level that isn't rational. Yet at the same time, it's not a chaotic mess of unpredictability, and psychology's fundamental conviction is that with the right tools, we can still study that hidden underbelly that our rational reflections tend to miss.
Yeah, that's a really nice question as well. And it goes back to Ken Lambert's question in many ways, I think. I would suggest that the image of thinking that I would like to give, and I think one finds, for instance, in Plato, is very full of pathos, and to turn it into something abstract is in many ways, and this, in many ways to cut off, to abort the full force of what thinking is, the full performance of thinking. And so I think I tend to believe that thinking is a kind of performative event with even with its pathos, with its form of suffering, feeling, and emotion. And so that it would seem to want to be a topic for psychoanalysis or psychology, I think is a fair question. But I do believe the idea that we might have, that philosophy might need to broaden its own conception of what thinking is and let it be much more of an event of performance and pathos. And that's what the beauty of reading Plato is. It's one of the few places in which one really does get this. And one finds it occasionally in people, Nietzsche, others, but any good philosophical writer, I think, is able to tap into, the idea that thinking is not an abstraction, but something lived and felt. And so that's how I would answer that.
So with advanced apologies for pushing our time limit, I can't resist just asking a question that I think it connects with so many of the other questions that have been asked. I'll try and keep it quick, but I have a lot going on in my head, so apologies in advance. So I was really with you up until about the halfway point, Denny, when you were outlining what really is the crisis of the difficulty of thinking, or the lack of thinking in terms of the good in our current condition. But I found it interesting where you took a turn around the halfway point, and you said you're not really interested in the sources of the disconnection, or the causes of the disconnection. And you kind of made a decision then to start talking about philosophy and thinking, and the burden of philosophy, or the responsibility of philosophy. I'm not in disagreement with what you say about philosophy, and so much of it I agree with, especially about the humility of thinking, something which takes me back right to the beginning of my engagement with philosophy at all. Socrates was my hero for many years, precisely because he, professed ignorance. So it's not a disagreement, but I wanted to just think about a different path from the pathos, the feeling of crisis and the despair. And it is with Arendt still, and it centers on the concept of responsibility, which I'm really happy you brought up, because the concept of responsibility just seems so important, and important for Arendt, and especially in the origins of totalitarianism. So when I've taught that work, I've had to be so careful, because what I read, especially in the first few chapters, is Arendt effectively saying that Jews in the 19th century and into the early 20th century are in part responsible for anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism that they faced. And when I read that, I was just like, how on earth do I explain this or understand it even? But working through it was profoundly rewarding, because very complementary to what you said, you have to understand what kind of responsibility is being invoked here. It's not juridical responsibility. It's not even a kind of cause and effect mechanical responsibility, as though of course this was going to happen if you acted this way. And I actually don't think it's a moral responsibility either, where it's like you're at fault, where you should have seen that this was wrong, and that you're to blame for this. So I tried to explain it and understand it as a political responsibility. And what does that mean? Well, through my reading of the origins of totalitarianism, hugely influenced by my background and in Aristotle, and the influence of Aristotle in my thinking, but also on Arendt. I've understood this as Arendt saying, as human beings, you're always capable of acting differently. Always. And always, except at the very most extreme circumstances of human oppression, such as in Auschwitz and in totalitarianism, actually, not even just in the camps, but society as a camp. So except at the most extreme conditions of existence, humans are always capable of acting otherwise. And so one always has to think about one's actions and one's situation in terms of how could I have acted otherwise, and how can I act otherwise? Now, part of that, I think, and what Arendt's getting at, is there was a way in which Jews could have acted otherwise collectively, not just as Jews, but also as part of a human race and a set of human animals that connect with other people. And this directs us to a whole different set of resources and actions and thinking even about how to respond to terrible situations. And it's a little bit telling for me where you agree so heavily with the idea of power as a violence, because it seems to leave us thinking about power solely in negative terms, but like power is also capacity and capability. And what I think Arendt is trying to push in the origins of totalitarianism is that as human beings, we have enormous potency, an enormous potency that comes from collective action. And in times when that collective action is so wanting, the source for renewed collective action, I think, is in natality. it's in the fact that there's a constant transformation of the social body, because human beings are always dying and being reborn. And when a human being is born, newness comes into the world. And so this holds out some hope. And as I was thinking through this question and thinking about these issues, I thought, you know, in some respects, it's telling that the most active climate change activists have been young people, because I think in some respects they just haven't quite yet been jaded enough by contemporary circumstances, and they haven't quite been so denuded by contemporary circumstances. They still have a sense of the possibility of acting otherwise. And I feel like that is where we need to go to think about responding to the crisis. And it's much more, for me, empowering than simply thinking about philosophy as this internal practice.
Yeah, that's those are great remarks, Tristan. I'll try and be very, very brief because you've said so much. I think, first of all, I stand corrected on the question of power. You're absolutely right. I took the question of power as a kind of negative only. And so I missed, you're absolutely right. And I'm immensely grateful that you point that out, because power isn't only destructive, it can be constructive. It can be world building as well. And so I take that as a very important qualification. A second remark, I only have three, and they'll be quick. Second remark about responsibility. It's a word that I think I believe we need to think about a little more. The word responsibility comes in for the first uses by Heine in German for Verantwortlichkeit. Verantworten was always responsibility is first used by Heine in about 1830. To be responsible, and in the Latin causa is a word that is only juridical until the early 19th century. And so I think we get juridical and ethical and political concepts all mashed together. And so it gets messy. And that's why I always want to make the distinction between responsibility and accountability. So I think that discussion is a complex one. But you mentioned, and the final point is, you mentioned birth. I've become a big baby fan lately. And I've always been a fan of short little people with knowledge deficits, but which is what I think of as children. But the interesting thing is, I think the important thing about natality is something that I might not fully grasp, is that we enter the world and we leave the world utterly vulnerable. So when you're born, you're completely vulnerable. And when you die, the corpse is completely vulnerable. You know, we're at the beginning and end of life, we're delivered over beyond ourselves. And that vulnerability is the thing I would begin to think about in terms of what natality means too, because in that sense of being responsible for one who cannot take, I mean, most animals are born, they can take care of themselves within 5 minutes, you know, or a couple of weeks, months. Human beings, well, I'm still going after 14 years. So, I mean, human beings really need help. And I think that is the thing about birth that I would be thinking about. And also even death is this way in which we become vulnerable at the end of life. So that's how I would try to answer your good points. Thanks.
Thanks so much. This has been incredibly stimulating and moving. So thanks again, Denny. And yeah, please join me in thanking Denny for this wonderful time and talk. And stay tuned. We'll be back in about a month on the Critical Antiquities Workshop for a book launch of Ramsay McLeay's Old Schools. So I hope you can join us then. Thanks, Denny.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. And nice to see so many old friends too. Goodbye.